European political parties are a fiction. They don't exist. Why should I vote for the European elections? And it's difficult to provide an answer. Why should you vote for the European elections? If there's no link between your vote and the political color of the European Commission, meaning the government of Europe, why should you vote? If we find ourselves where we are, is largely the responsibility of national capitals and national political elite. It's not the fault of Europe. It's not the European institution. Doing what the member states ask her to do, to negotiate a shitty deal with Trump, give an example, but they don't take responsibility.
What future do you see, if any, for the EU project? This is Moving Europe podcast, where we bring to you a European perspective on topics that matter.
And if you like our content, then please don't forget to like and subscribe.
Today, we are joined by Alberto Alemanno, European law professor and founder of The Good Lobby. Thanks a lot, Alberto, for being here.
For having me and to join Moving Europe.
So, Alberto, let's directly go into the substance. AfD is the second most popular political party in Germany. In France, the government just fallen with Le Pen and Bardella gaining more and more consensus, and in Italy, Meloni is strongly in power. What future do you see, if any, for the EU project?
The project of Europe has certainly been going through better times. I think it's a moment pretty dark in contemporary European history, and the project itself is challenged. At the same time, talking about the project after 70 years makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. Europe is no longer a project.
Yeah.
Mm? So it's something pretty resilient, pretty solid. It has been challenged so many times. Brexit symbolizes the fact that Europe somehow is no longer irreversible. It's something that could be stopped, can be paused, but I remain hopeful. Why? Because many of the challenges brought to the European integration project by these far-right forces are pretty much challenges that allow the people of Europe to actually own Europe and the ability of Europe to address those questions. What I mean by that is that many of the claims that AfD or Fratelli d'Italia or Vox in Spain do make in the public space do help us to realize the shortcomings of Europe. Why? Because Europeans are looking at Europe no longer as a troublemaker, but as a problem fixer. If the nation state is not able to deliver, well, there should be something else they're delivering. And obviously, these far-right forces are providing nationalistic solutions that are completely out of tune with the nature of the problem they need to address. So in a way, they're helping us in the long term, but in the short term, it's painful to see. That's my take.
Fair, because politically, it seems indeed like from an external perspective that Europe is losing consensus.
Well, in reality, public opinion proves the opposite, right? Europe has never been as popular among the people. We have a record high support for the project, with over 80% of people saying we expect the EU to do more, be it on defense, be on social issues, even issues where the European cannot do much about it, which seems to show a bit of a paradox. In a moment in which these political parties are capitalizing on an anti-European sentiment, in reality, the sentiment overall in public opinion is going closer to Europe, meaning an entity that perhaps they don't fully identify because it's still perceived as far apart. We will see then later why it is the case. But at the same time, they expect Europe and not the nation state to provide those answers. So how do we make sense of it? And then let me add that when talking about European politics, we keep talking about 27 national political systems. Yeah. So you didn't ask me about the patriots of Europe. You didn't ask me about the sovereignist of Europe. You didn't ask me about ECR. So these parliamentary groups, they are calling the shots at the European level. You asked me about AfD. You talked me about Protests of Europe. These are national political forces that only by ricochet and directly play a role on the European political stage. So basically, we lack a European political space where these national preferences are aggregated. So my counterfactual as a legal scholar, political scientist working on those issues is how the political preference of Europe would look like today if we were asking these citizens of Europe to express them at the pan-European level. How different would that be? We would have the same support for the equivalent of AfD. Well, we don't have a European-wide AfD.
So are you saying a little bit that, as long as the systems are national, we're basically incentivizing nationalist politics and nationalist views? It's a little bit what you're claiming, no?
I didn't go as far, but I can own this statement. I think nationalistic forces are, in the long term, making the case for Europe, because they prove the national answer don't really provide a solution. But at the same time, in the short term, they are really the symptom of this inability of the European political process to deliver.
Yeah, and I'm curious just because the other day we all watched the big protest in the United Kingdom, right? And they're really, when people were interviewed, they were saying, we're feeling this lack of identity. We want to reclaim our cultural heritage. How do you think we can go away from this merely national identity culture to a more European identity culture?
Well, I'm glad that that event took place in the UK, meaning in a no longer member states of the Union, because somehow it allows us not to focus on that. But essentially, my work over the years has proven that as soon as you Europeanize a conversation, a discussion, being on research, being on defense, being on sport, all of a sudden citizens feel that they can be Germans, Italians, Slovenians, and Europeans at the same time. In other words, is the experience of Europe that allow people to accept, to actually have coexisting identities. And this explains the major success of the Erasmus program, which unfortunately it only opens up to university students. But what if we had many more Europeanizers as mechanisms that allow many more citizens to be confronted to Europe? So if you look at data, we have approximately 4% of the European population that lives in a different country than the country in which they were born. Well, the three of us, plus many people listening, watching to us right now, right? Most of those people are completely in acceptance of the fact that they are wearing different hats and all these. But when you look beyond this 4%, which makes more or less 70, 80 million people in Europe, you have another figure, which is 50% of citizens of Europe are exposed to another country because they go there on holiday, because they work there once in a while, because their family, their kids. So 1 European out of 2 is already exposed to Europe, but the other 50% is not. Yeah. And my guess, which should be empirically tested, is that most of the people who express this nationalistic sentiment or this protest vote against the union probably belong to those who are not mobile. In other words, those who are mobile in Europe tend to be more in acceptance of this project.
Yeah. But I also think that the European Union has not been very effective in communicating its result and the progress of the EU itself. So we talk about roaming, we talk about Erasmus, but in your opinion, is the EU selling its political achievement well, or it could do better?
It's not the European job to talk about its achievement. Right? It would be like the Italian Republic or the President Republic in Italy and Germany or the king in Spain telling what the government has been doing. That's not how it works. That's not how it should work. The job to communicate about Europe is about politicians. We should have members of the European Parliament who stop being faceless. Who knows the members of the European Parliament? Perhaps 5, 6, not even that. So let's start shifting the weight of Europe towards those people who bear the responsibility of Europe. These are the people who are paid to think and act on behalf of Europeans. In the Treaty of Lisbon is written that the members of parliament represent all Europeans, not only those who voted for them. So let's realize that it's not European job. And if Europe does communication, it looks like propaganda because it is propaganda, right? So we need to really flip entirely the logic and say, let's empower everybody, civil society organizations, influencers, podcasters, political leaders at the national and European level to actually be more pedagogical, to explain and unpack. There are things that are no longer decided in the national capital. They are decided here. Not because Europe is a monster, but because that's what they decided to do, to share sovereignty back in the 50s and to decide now that they want to protect Europe together through a defense system. So let's shift the balance and the power on those people. They have the power, but they hide it. So there's this double game that keeps playing and fueling this idea that at the end of the day is always European fault. So you bash the European Union instead of actually giving the chance to people to talk and say what they think about Europe.
Yeah, and one thing which was always close to your heart is to motivate people to get themselves more engaged in European politics. And I'm wondering if you talk, in your daily life to people, how are you advising them to do this? What should they do?
Well, something that is very counterintuitive is to say that Europe provides more opportunities than the average member state of the Union to citizens to actually have a say. And I spent 20 years doing research about this and showing that Europe has petitions to the European Parliament, as European citizen initiatives, as complaints to the European Ombudsman, complaints to the European Commission. So many avenues of participation available to them that are very little known and very little used. Can you imagine that the European Citizen Initiative that allows 7 citizens coming from 7 European countries to ask the European Union for a new policy or to revise a policy or to stop something has been used only 100 times?
Yes.
That mobilize approximately 40 million people who have been giving a signature. We are talking about peanuts. What if we had, instead of 120 ECIs registered, we had 300 or 3,000 or 100,000? When we registered the first ECI back in 2012, we asked the European Union to stop international roaming charges. Right? It was an impossible thing. It was utopian. But it makes sense because already at the time there was Schengen. There were not checks at the border, but you were receiving an SMS saying, from now on, you're going to be taxed more. You're going to be making calls or receiving calls. And we didn't take credit for this. We just got the ball rolling, and then the commissioner themselves took credit for it. And then many CEO, telecom CEO said, well, there was a case for consolidation, and they just went for it. Let's amplify that story, and that's why I keep insisting, and I'm becoming a bit of an evangelist of ECI and tools. But if we only, each European would animate one ECI or sign for one ECI, we would have a completely different interaction with the European institution, and we would empower European politicians to actually engage more. Because they would be saying, I give you a story because it's super short. But, a month ago with my students in Albach, we decided to start a new European Citizen Initiative. So we said, well, passenger right regulation, so the money we get when in Europe we get a delay or we get a flight cancel, will be worse enough. So now we get a 250 euros if there's a 3 hours delay. But now they want to make it 4 hours delay. That's the first time in history that you're worse enough the consumer protection. So we get, no, this is unacceptable. We register an ECI to play a role in the political process. There's an amendment now process. And only 2 days ago, we got a call from the rapporteur who needs us to be in the parliamentary committee. Is actually my students showing up. We're very young professional. One is in Natolin, another one comes from the region, and they're going to be there sharing their point. Why? Because citizens need to be involved. They're going to be those affected. So that's a little story happening right now. Everybody of us could be involved.
Yeah, because the impact can be massive of these things. Like, they look like things that are small, but in the end, at an aggregate level, they can have an amazing impact. And in your opinion, why political party pro-European are not pushing that much on European view, European initiative? Do you think there is a lacking of effort in this perspective?
European political parties are a fiction. They don't exist. They are an aggregate of national political elected under a banner that is not even presented to the public. So how many Italians know that when voting Forza Italia in Italy, they are actually voting for Les Républicains in France, they're voting for CDU in Germany? How many of them? None, because the European political party is simply not visible to their eyes. Yeah. So in the absence of a European political party system, we cannot ask citizens to hold accountable their elected representatives because they don't even know where they stand in Europe. There are parties in Europe, Five Star Movement in Italy is an example, but there are many more, right? They never told us where they stand in Europe because sometimes they reach the independent group, sometimes are with the Greens, sometimes with the Socialists, and it's fine, it's their choice, but they're not readable, right? And they have nothing against with the Five Star Movement. I can provide you examples from other countries. But I think that's interesting. It's a party that has been around for over 15 years. They got elected dozens of MEPs, and they have no official position on Europe. Nice. They are pro-European, skeptical on Europe. They are on the left, they're on the right. We still don't know.
They change opinion many times, I will say.
This fact of changing opinion is great, right? Intelligent people need to change opinion, but this should be disclosed to the people. And here, because you don't have to tell, then you can sneak out, right? You can take one position and say something else, and all of this render the system more confusing and less intelligible, I would say, for the average voter, that sometimes ask himself or herself, why should I vote for the European elections? And it's difficult to provide an answer. Why should you vote for the European elections? No. If there's no link between your vote and the political color of the European Commission, meaning the government of Europe, why should you vote? And the current Commission does not necessarily reflect the political preference that had been expressed last June, because it's a bit on the left, meaning center-left, is a bit on the center-right when you look at the voting pattern. So there are two parliamentary majority supporting one government. I challenge anyone to look at government around the world in a parliamentary democratic system where you have two parliamentary majorities, and we accept it. We kind of normalize it, even though in the State of the Union we heard that Ursula von der Leyen, the president, said, no, from now on, I'm going to be sticking to the pro-European majority. Let's see if it is true.
And I think if we're well informed, you yourself tried to candidate for Parliament with Bio Europa. Also, I think trying to counter move some of those trends, to advocate more for a more united Europe.
Well, yes, I think my political engagement has always been broader than the electoral one. I see myself as a political actor, but not necessarily through the electoral process. But it is true that I ran for office at some point because I wanted to learn and I wanted to see what it was possible. It was a very specific historical moment in 2019 in Italy. We felt a lot of pressure. There was this droitisation. There was a lot of xenophobic behavior, conduct. There was a lot of pushback against, I think, the idea of diversity. You might remember all the pushback against migrants and NGOs. And I felt this was the right time to get involved. So we set up a party, which was more a movement in a matter of few weeks. And people I really like, with whom I had the chance to work over time, like Marco Cappato.
Yes.
I simply thought this is the right time to put my face, as you're putting your face with the podcast, and just engage. And said, that's where I stand. I remain a scholar, I remain a researcher, I try to analyze this, but I also want to show my commitment to push. And that's what I did. The campaign was very slow, it was very short and compact. And all of a sudden we realized that there was a potential, but I decided to basically make a step back and to say, no, I'm probably more effective as a political actor outside of the logic of political parties and movements.
But then let's talk a bit about what you did outside. 10 years ago, you founded the Good Lobby, which is an organization which tries to support individuals, but also organizations to have more influence, also at the European political level. Can you tell us a bit what's your vision for this project, for this organization, the Good Lobby?
Well, the Good Lobby is really born out of this intuition that if only citizens realize they can also become part of this big project that transcends the nation state, that would be win-win. It would be good for them, for their agency, for their political awareness, but it would also be good for the project in the long run. So we wanted to find a way which was not a political party, was not a think tank. It was something very unusual, which is a non-profit organization that looks like a movement. It has become partly a movement that basically claims that we should equalize access to power. So everybody should get the same time, speaking time vis-a-vis politicians, because at the end of the day, that's what everybody does, right? Everybody in capitals of Europe, in Brussels included, we talk to people with power and we try to persuade them. So what I was saying at the time, and I conceptualized it in a book, is that you have two choices in life, right? They keep telling us you can vote or you can run for office. And running for office is a bit too much, as I just demonstrated to you. And voting is a bit too little. Is there something in between? And to me, something in between is to become a citizen lobbyist, to become an active citizen that in a variety of mobilization forms engages. And that's exactly what big companies do. They try in the space in between elections to hold accountable decision makers, to meet them, to share ideas, so as to nurture with their ideas a political process, instead of waiting for the next elections or saying, well, should I run for office, right? And this space had to be beautified, had to be demystified, had to be democratize, and that's basically our battle. So every year we pick 2 or 3 major issues. It could be an ethical scandal, it could be the new rules of procedure of the parliament, it could be lobby regulation, and we just go for it. And we just say, we need to get more transparency, we need to have more access, we need to have more funds for civil society, because come on, we live in a city where 75% of the meetings taking place between the European institution and third party is about big companies, not even small and medium, but big companies. And the remaining 25% of the meetings is about civil society organization, NGO. So there's a David and Goliath battle, which epistemically is very problematic, because if you're on the receiving end, if you are a staff in the European institution, if you are an MEPs, well, you receive only part of the story. You don't get all the information you need to get the best decision. So we need some corrective. And I think that's where we are. We play a role in that space.
And I think here you mentioned something very cool, that politics is not just either voting or running for office, but it's also showing up your face and really talking to politicians and to representatives. You founded this project 10 years ago. Can you tell us the best moment, in your opinion, in these 10 years, the best battle you fought you are proud of? And how did you feel about that? And I would also be curious to know a bit more about the elections, like I was running for office, like the emotions that you did feel.
Well, I would say participatory democracy, meaning doing the kind of things we've been doing with the good lobby, is a very different ball game than running for office. Running for office is a very ego trip. It's about you. You talk about yourself. You talk about how you can change the world. Whereas participatory democracy needs other people. You cannot do it alone. You cannot be a super activist, right? You look at Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg alone would have not been able to become that symbol, right, in terms of raising awareness about the climate. So very different phenomena. Collective action is a very different thing that in politics doesn't really find much space. So it's really about mindset. Where do you feel more comfortable? And I think today power is no longer all power, which is like, centralized, hierarchical. Power is something diffuse that you need to mobilize, that you need to exercise in a more leaderless way. And we have been successful with a good lobby every single time we managed to get this magic happen. So there were coalitions of sometimes even NGOs working with a few companies who were very progressive on this idea. So a lot of work on the Green New Deal, the preparation of the Green New Deal, Triple D directive. So the due diligence is part of that story. The way in which we get whistleblowing protection in Europe was 2014. Nobody was talking about whistleblowing protection. We had Ed Snowden, who was considered to be a criminal, but no European political party was taking a stance. And we said, basically whistleblowers are people who say and report something that is, of wrongdoing in their company or in a public authority. It's a system of anti-corruption. We need to protect those people, because as soon as they speak up, they lose their job. So let's try to get a European regulation on this, and we push for it, and we actually presented a draft in the European Parliament without being politicians. And the people there, including the Commission, Timmermans at the time, the Commission said, "Wow, that's a great idea," and they included it in the legislative program. That's a big win. It was the beginning, and again, we didn't know where we could have gone, but we set the agenda. And I think in Europe is relatively easy to set the agenda. If you have a big idea, you have an evidence base, you create a coalition, because in a way you are preparing the work that the officials should be doing. You prepare it for them, you pre-digest it, and then you put it on the table. So and that's exactly what companies do most of the time.
And did you find it, especially in the beginning of this journey? Now you're a bit more established, but I imagine when you started 10 years ago, you were still smaller. So how did you manage to engage enough people in it to make it a success?
Well, it's a journey that required a lot of persistence, because initially very few people understood what we were trying to do. Right, lobbying was and remains to be perceived as a very negative thing. So our label was weird. Good, that means that we are the bad lobbyists if you are the good lobbyists. No, this is not the point. Everybody can be a good lobbyist if you do it transparently, if you do it in accountability. So we had to face this kind of socio-cultural obstacles. And then it was tricky also in terms of how do you make it work, right? Who pays this work? So you need to start knocking the doors to some foundations across Europe to get some funding. You need to get compliant with the transparency register that back in the days I was advocating for. So you realize how these compliance costs also slow you down. And then over the years, you manage to find a space that seems to be, pretty viable, People recognize the work you do. They approach you. They ask for training, for strategies, both from the public and the private, mainly for civil society, but also for other actors. So in a way, we kind of made it, but we haven't made it to the point that our job or our mission is over. I think we are far from it. We are far from it. I wish I could say we are no longer needed. I can go back and just being a professor.
But probably this podcast would not exist if your mission was over as well. No, but I think it's amazing and very inspiring what you said. And talking about lobbying, there is really like a misconception also in Italy. Like when you talk about lobbying, it's something shady, something gray. So did you see that the image of lobbying has changed across the years, or is still very negatively?
Lobbying is a bit like Europe, right? You have to experience it before understanding it, right? So lobbying is the most legitimate thing you can do. Each of us is a lobbyist. Each of us try to persuade others about your reason, about your cause, about your sensibilities, about your interests. So it's a legitimate activity of what we do in a democracy. If we have a system, a democratic system, that has no lobbying, then that system is not democratic, right? So it is a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, but it's a necessary condition for having a democratic system. It's an activity that is legal. It is also needed. Why? Because the major rationale for lobbying is that you're providing arguments, you're providing evidence, you're providing more elements. So it's about information. So the economists think about lobbying as basically power sharing, because you are sharing data, you're sharing information that the policymakers need to know in order to understand what impact my decision is going to have on people, right? You are public officials. You cannot be ubiquitous. You cannot be omniscient. You cannot know everything that is happening around the world. You need to be around by people affected, right, by those decisions. Once you get this, you understand that lobby is necessary. Having said so, it has to be circumscribed, it has to be confined to activities which are, first of all, transparent, and then they are reported so people might know about them. And then there should also be a responsibility in the way in which you exercise your power. I give you an example. If I represent a big companies or a big business association, because in Brussels it's more about companies coming together and lobbying together, and I show up with a commissioner, and I realize that in public consultation there's nobody from the other side, NGOs, either trade unions, I should actually say, well, perhaps I need to exercise a bit of self-restraint and say, okay, this is my point. But you would benefit as an institution to also listen and call up on the other organization. And I've been arguing in my more legal research, there is a procedural duty of the European officials to actually look proactively for those interests to be in the room. And unless everybody is around the table, we cannot close a public consultation.
Yeah. And do you feel there is a big movement around good lobbying for a better and more transparent Europe, or you feel more that your project is unique?
Well, there is a global movement towards whitening lobbying, beautifying it, and reclaiming it by civil society. So a couple of years ago, I published an ethnographic studies identifying all the organizations around the world that in different ways are reclaiming lobbying as a form of political innovation, as something that is needed to create a better feedback loop between the elected representatives and the citizens that runs in parallel with the electoral system. Because at the end of the day, the new generation of politicians, they should be more entrepreneurial. They should be looking for ideas, because otherwise the overall quality of debate, if you think about what's happening in Brussels nowadays, is very poor. There are very few ideas. There's very few generation of ideas. So they need those communities, those spaces, a new democratic routine of actually listening their base. So in a way, it's win-win. And in Europe, I think it acquires more interest because of the unique transnational experience of European democracy, the so-called democratic deficit. I think there are many democratic deficits, representation, legitimation, accountability, that all together show that perhaps in Europe, there's even more case to legitimize lobbying as an opportunity for citizens to raise from the bottom and to show up and say, Brussels is far away. No, it's much closer than what you think. Because if you write an email to a European official, it's going to get back to you in 7 days. I wish that at the national level would be the same.
Well, yes, hopefully. But, and you mentioned something very interesting. So a transnational idea of politics and of Europe. And one of your main battles, if I'm not mistaken, has been for transnational list, meaning that we elect European leaders at a continent level. First of all, how realistic you think this is going to happen in the future? And secondly, why is it important? If you can tell to the audience very briefly, why is something that matters?
Think about the European elections. They take place every 5 years. They take place on different dates. So I think some countries start voting on Thursday, like the Dutch, and then the Belgium, and then the Slovenian, and then some. So we don't have a European election day, not even the day. We vote for national parties, presenting national candidates, running on national platforms. There's nothing European in the European elections. The only way to Europeanize the elections and to allow all the citizens to have one political offer, the center, the right, the social, the conservative, is to actually say we have one European political competition happening in one day with X amount of parties presented in the same way to all 300 million plus potential voters, with common candidates running all around. So you can be German and you can be voted in Italy, you can be Portuguese and be voted by a poll. And that political process is exactly what we lack in Europe. And this has huge repercussions, because today we are not able to know what are the political preferences of European unions, because we have asked that question in the national state. People are voting with their national hat and not with their European. What if instead we would allow them to vote and expressing their preference across the European Union? I've been writing and advocating non-stop since 1999 that the only way for Europe to advance in its integration and to turn from a project into a real thing, it's actually to Europeanize the political space. This is what is holding us back. This is the reason why political leaders are not able to talk with one voice, because each of them, if you think it, are all accountable to only their national constituency. Even the most pro-European, like Macron, is not accountable to German voters, is not accountable to Slovaks, right? So at the end of the day, he has to he has to satisfy his own French audience. And that's problematic, because the decision of the European Council, the decision of Giorgia Meloni in the European Council, affect all European citizens. But citizens have no say in the election or in the government formation of Giorgia Meloni. This is problematic. There's an asymmetry, right? So it's very structural. I'm a bit of an institutional designer. That's what I'm good at. So I think about new institutions, new mechanisms, new procedures, because those really matter. And even having, since you asked me what's the future of transnational list, even having only 6, 7, 8 members of the European Parliament being elected at the pan-European level, which was essentially the last proposal that the European Parliament passed in 2021, in 2018 voted against, 400 voted against out of 700, would have been a major game changer, because all of a sudden we could say those 7, those 8 MEPs actually do represent those European political families. So the incumbent political parties, including the Five-Star Movement, would have had to tell voters before the European elections, not after, where do they stand? Yeah. Because they wanted to compete for one of these 8 transnational posts, right? So the European White College, it's a precondition for everything we're going to be trying to do. So Mario Draghi is not speaking in political terms, he's speaking in more economic and financial and fiscal ones. But in essence, he's basically saying, with the current level of socioeconomic integration, the only way to support it is to switch to a level of political integration which is at least adequate. He's not saying this directly, but that's what he's alluding to, right? And the only way to make it happen, so to take Mario Draghi's report and recipe seriously, is to embrace this kind of deep reforms. And at the moment, there's very little appetite for transnational list. There are different blocks, right? At the time when we campaigned in 2018, I remember Spain, Italy, and France supporting us. We collected 300,000 signatures in 24 hours. We got a meeting in the Élysée, we got a meeting with Rajoy, and we got a meeting with Gentiloni, and they said, keep going. We had all the Central European countries already saying this is not a good idea. They want to remain in control of the European project. They want to filter the cleavages of Europe through the national lens. So this is a bit the divide Some Nordics are also favorable these days, but the current rapporteur, who is an excellent Spaniard socialist MEPs, doesn't seem to find enough appetite, to continue this battle. But there will be meetings, but this issue has been politicized to the point that, despite being an expert on this issue for over 20 years, my invitation to the Constitutional Affairs Committee was cancelled on the eve of the very same event. So you see the political, they know that I'm a scholar and researcher, but I'm also a proponent. I really think that this would be the way forward. But the level of politicization prevented somebody like me to be in the room.
And I think it was quite interesting because at the time, maybe 3-4 years ago, there was a little bit of a momentum there. So we were hoping maybe we could get there. And I just the other day, I was rewatching one of the council meetings then 1 year before the European elections. And then essentially the main argument was like, yeah, good idea, but we're late now, so let's forget about it until the next mandate. So I'm a bit afraid that, it gets forgotten until then it's immediately after the election again. And then it's again, oh, we're too late now.
Right. That's the story of the electoral rules. At the end of the day, the electoral law reform, it's about defining the rules of the game. And to me, it should be central. Think about in the country we probably know best, which is Italy. Every single time we talk about electoral reform, it's become central. Everybody talks about this. It's about how people get elected, how people get power. And in Europe, we don't even cover this. Even political, that covers everything on the electoral law. They thought there's not much demand, there's not public. And to me, this is impossible to explain because this is a central issue that nobody wants to own, nobody wants to push for. At the end of the day, everybody was to vote and actually propose this. The European Parliament, which is exceptional, usually it's the Commission proposing, but on the electoral law is the Parliament. They know how to get elected, they know how to get re-elected, but they don't know what is going to happen if the rules of the game are going to change. Suddenly they need to campaign across the European Union. And think about the quality of the average MEP. I mean, most of them are not very good at speaking in different languages than their own. Most of these people are very much own their seat and their post, their political party affiliation. They're not necessarily deserve it in terms of merit or policy impact. So all of this would change, right? They would be challenged. So there's an inherent conflict of interest in the way in which the incumbent operator might be a bit cautious in embarking on this journey. But 2019 was the apex. 2019, you had Volt, you had DM, you had traditional parties like the Greens, partly the Socialists saying, we want to present ourselves with one European political party offering. They try at least, but they were not necessarily rewarded. And the whole conversation got also smashed by the Spitzenkandidaten idea, which is a shortcut, right? Spitzenkandidaten basically is to say, we keep the system as it is, but in order to allow the citizen voting for a particular party, that there is a link between his vote or her vote and the political color of the commission, we're going to find a symbol, a proxy, which is the lead candidate representing that party at the European level. So to go back to my example, you know that when voting Forza Italia in Italy, you're going to be voting for a common candidate from the EPP, from the Republican, that is one. And that person will be representing that political family. So it's a shortcut. It worked in 2014 with Mr. Juncker. It worked much less in 2019 because basically Ursula von der Leyen didn't run for office. You don't need to run for office, but it was certainly she was not a Spitzenkandidatin. And in 2024, she kind of, she owned it because she was the only visible one and belonging to the party getting more of the votes, then it was almost automatic. So what's the point about David Spitzenkandidaten?
But even there, there was, I remember before the European elections, there was kind of this Spitzenkandidaten debate, And I think nobody watched it, because why would you watch it if in any case, then you're voting for your national constituencies. So there was this attempt to fake a bit the European level, and
empirical data suggests that only 5-6% of the European voters were aware of the Spitzenkandidaten when he counted 2014 and 2019. So there's very little. Usually the countries that are more aware of the existence of this link are the countries where the Spitzenkandidat come from. So it was Mr. Schulz in Germany, Mr. Juncker, because they were running at the same time in Germany, Franz Timmermans, because he was running in the Netherlands. So those countries benefited in terms of turnout. The more people show up. And turnout is not bad. 1 out of 2 European voters show up for the European elections. But that means there's an enormous untapped potential. If only we would make the system much more intelligible, I think we could easily get 70%.
And I think here an important fact to mention is that the ones that believe the most in the European project are young people that are the future of Europe, but they are represented up to 5% in the European Parliament. So first of all, we need more young representation, if you agree with that. And is this also an education battle? Do we need, since to young generation, since the beginning, to feel European culturally? To install a sense of European identity?
I don't belong to those arguing that Europe can only evolve if we create a European demos. I don't think we need one demos. I think the idea of my colleague and co-author Calypso Nicolaidis of having a democracy, so being Italians, Slovenians, Croatians, Germans, and Europeans at the time is much better. But certainly getting and anticipating this exposure to Europe, like having Erasmus for primary school, would be much more powerful, right, than just waiting for later stage. And I think we have been witnessing, and that's something that keeps me not only awake at night, but it somehow gives me some hope for the future, is to say that there has never been so much coverage on Europe as in the last 3 or 4 years, right? When I arrived here, your age, there was one thing called European Voice, which was a sister publication of The Economist, writing good article, but very dull. There was not all the sexification of Europe that happened with Politico and Euractiv and EU Observer and now The Correspondent and all what is happening now. It's amazing. The podcast ecosystem that we're also contributing to today, all of this is new, but this is addressing a need and a demand from the bottom of citizens. They want to know more. They are curious, they want to know more, and they don't feel informed enough because they realize decisions being taken place there, but they don't have necessarily the elements to fully make sense of those. And that's what I took away of the conference on the future of Europe, which was a very, let's say, top-down transnational democratic experiment that occurred during COVID time. I was very involved in the design, in running it, notably in the Florence one, in the democracy part. And quite frankly, it was so magic to be there and to realize that these 800 citizens randomly selected from all over Europe, people who don't speak English. 90% were not able to speak English. They could be your aunt, it could be my cousin. 25% of them were below 25 years old. All these people were together communicating and they were asked, what do you think about Europe? What do you expect from Europe? And there was so much freshness. So it was a top-down thing, very run by the institutions, but it was fresh. The raw material was real and genuine. And the recommendations that emerged out of it, that were largely neglected by the institutions and even more by the European political parties, were clearly showing that if people are given the tool, they meet some people sharing, as I'm doing today with you, and the work you do with the podcast, they feel empowered and they have a say, they have their own ideas. And those ideas are so valuable. So how paradoxical that the European Union is depriving itself from the most immediate source of legitimacy, that is what people think, because people hold sovereignty. People hold the key of the future of the European integration project, but we don't listen to them because we don't give them the chance to express their preferences. So that's the gap that we often been focusing on. In the year 2000, the so-called white paper on governance, which is the best possible piece ever written by the European institutions, launched a debate. And they said, we need to change that. This is 25 years ago. And the quality of that debate was 10 times higher than the quality we are having today. So we got stuck.
But maybe then the conference, I mean, even though it was not taken up a lot maybe, but maybe it could be an incubator also for people to realize that they can also organize themselves, no? And to try to organize these citizens panels on a private level to try to influence.
It was a fantastic experiment. It was the first time ever in which a transnational democratic exercise of what we call mini public occurred. We showed that it was possible to do it. We show and convey the message that now it should not be driven by the institution, but it should be driven by the bottom up. In the Democratic Odyssey, which is a big project that has been happening around the world, around Europe in particular in the last year, is actually showing this. There are people, ordinary citizens, people like us, who every Saturday gather and meet and they start to organize these citizens' assemblies that are going to give ideas, inputs. And my job as an institutionalist here is really trying to connect the freshness of these ideas with the institutional machinery? And the answer is ECIs, petitions, complaints, letters. We need to find a bridge and to build a bridge. And that's how I see myself, somebody who can communicate with different communities and try to create channels of participation that would really beneficial for the individuals, for the collective, and for the European Union and politicians themselves. Because at the end of the day, politicians need popular support. So they need to listen much more than what they do. Think about having European-wide referenda, asking European citizens on the same day, should we support Ukraine? Up to now. European-wide referendum on how do we respond to Trump? Should we sign for this deal? Yes or no? We don't have an answer. We don't know.
Maybe it would have been a different deal. We will never know. We'll never know.
Might be renegotiated.
Yeah. But political parties as well are very important to connect the dots, no, between the popular need and perception and the elected representatives. But political party, even the most progressive, have a very low share of young people inside them and in influential position within the parties. Do you think this will change in the future?
Political parties hold the key to the access to the political experience. It is the political parties who decide who's going to run for the European elections. Is the national parties deciding who is going to run for national elections? So there's a bottleneck, right? And those are hollow parties. We call hollow parties now in political science because there are parties that historically have been emptying themselves of an ideological preference. So there are containers of different policy preferences, and they have very little incentive to inject freshness because the freshness is going to change the status quo. There are few political culture, the Netherlands, a bit Germany, where you really have a constant search for better or fresher minds, new ideas. It's much easier, I don't know, in your experience, if you're a Dutch person with different kind of profile, to knock the door to a party and to say, I'm going to go through the whole journey and going to run, give me a chance. But I don't think this is going to happen in a country like Italy, or it's going to be happening in Greece or in Portugal. It doesn't work that way.
Volt is very strong in Germany and Netherlands, for example. It's a young party, pan-European, and most elected.
I'm very close to Volt since the very beginning. I helped set up a party called it's called Europeans, which was Europeans in 2009, which was a pre-Volt. So when Volt set up was very much involved and close, and I think they're doing an amazing job in showing the limit of the current system. But obviously, we would need 3-4 Volt parties. We would need pan-European parties of different preferences. And now on the Volt, we basically see a party that is partly liberal, party social, party green, but not clearly defined. And the fact that a party like Volt could vote for von der Leyen twice, not only a year ago, but also the motional censor, to me is a bit surprising, because it seems to contradict the DNA of that party, which is really to push for further integration and to be an opposition party as opposed to be a party of government, because, we have a few candidates. The reason why they have elected in the Netherlands and Germany is very simple. It's about the electoral system. These are two proportionate systems, so the threshold is much lower. You don't need a 5% like in Italy, right? There's no threshold, and that's why you have 23 parties in the Netherlands when it comes to the National Assembly. So that's where the two parties are doing well, because the electoral system allows them to do well. And that's an extra reason why we need a European electoral system without a threshold, with a lower threshold, because now incumbent party have a huge advantage vis-a-vis the small ones, also in terms of funding. So Volt is not a European party. It's not a European political party. It cannot qualify. You need elected in 7 European countries, right? So that's very problematic. And, Volt, I remember advising them, in order to exist, you need to register in 27 countries, or at least in some of them. Yeah. This is not a European political party, but there's no way you can register once because those things don't exist, right? That's totally contradicting the idea of having a European election.
Yeah, we had as first guest Damian Boselager.
Damian is a very good friend.
Was the start.
Damian is a very good friend. We have been, and we still chat, and I'm certainly one of his interlocutor on the opposition, challenging them all the time. And I think they need some constructive, critical friends to go ahead.
Yeah, and you fought for Europe like 20 years. Like, I would like to know, I'm very curious, after all these years, how do you feel about all your battles, about Europe? Do you feel positive about where Europe has gone? Do you see a future, a better future?
Well, I just turned 50. and I've been around for almost 30 years old. I graduated in Bruges when I was 22, 23, and that's where my engagement started. And obviously that Europe was very different than today. Europe was something nobody questioned. People were proud of working for the European institutions. People were proud of saying they were European. It was the end of history, it was the end of civilization. Democracy was inevitable. Democratization was inevitable. All of this is gone. And in a way, it's also good that Europe is less complacent, is more self-aware about its colonialist past, is more self-aware about, all the things that Europe was not ready to accept. But in a way, we show up a bit too late and we are still too complacent, and we don't want to basically make this quantum leap. So my reading, and just spent a year in sabbatical writing a new book, and the whole idea is that at the end of the day, if we find ourselves where we are, is largely the responsibility of national capitals and national political elite. Is not the fault of Europe, is not the European institutions. The institutions have accepted, notably the Commission, to become a secretariat of the European Council. But this was not the idea. The original idea was to have the European Commission as a driving force, identifying the European common interest that is still written in the treaty, which is not the sum of the national interests. But then the European Council, which is an institution that was not even there. It was invented in the 70s. It was out of the treaty until 2009, was kind of added up to control the European Commission. All of this has been accepted by partly the Commission president of the time, starting from Mr. Barroso, all the way to the current president of the Commission, who really struggles to push back the will of the big countries in the European Council saying you should do this, this and that. But now is moment of truth. In my latest op-ed I just wrote for Project Syndicate, say this is a moment of truth, it's a turning point, because now everything that is wrong in Europe is scapegoat on von der Leyen. So von der Leyen is doing what the member states ask her to do, to negotiate a shitty deal with Trump, give an example. But they don't take responsibility. It's her fault. It's not their fault. But she just did what exactly wanted to do. But probably France would have been ready to retaliate. This game cannot last longer because, we're very close to the moment of truth. And who is losing in terms of perception and legitimacy is the European Union itself, which is the major vehicle we are using to advance. So dangerous game.
Alberto, we're almost at the end. We always ask one last question to each of our guests. Our podcast is called Moving Europe. So in one pitch line, how would you propose to move Europe?
We are all moving in Europe. Europe is not European institutions. It's us walking across the streets of Europe. So walk Europe. Every single time you walk the street in which you were born, in which you live, you are moving Europe. So we are moving Europe with our actions, with our brief. We need to live it. We need to embody it. We need to engage well beyond the institutions, because we are making Europe. We are Europe much more than the European institutions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alberto.
Inspiring. Thanks a lot.
To you.